And I think here I would start to recognize that Holland as actually one of the great providers in that field. People like John Borking from the Data Commissioner's Office and was one of the very early one in the DPO side, pushing the state of the art and the understanding of the technical solutions into the legal side. And people like Stefan Brands, as a cryptographer, for instance, has done remarkable stuff on the understanding of what we could do. 2 words of my background to do this. I am a computer scientist and with a double major in business strategy. Up during the 90s, I worked a lot with the question of how do we actually use this internet thing? Because these personal data, this is great stuff we could do, one-to-one marketing, and I was in banking and I was involved in a startup in optical telecommunication. But what I was really focused on is what you would today would consider trust. Because I realized one thing that really bothered me a lot. Now we're talking back in the 90s, is that with enough personal data, we were actually able to manipulate people's understanding of things. We could feed them their historic information back in such a way that they weren't aware they were actually being manipulated. This was possible already in the 90s. Okay. What was even worse was that we realized, or at least I realized, there were more than me, that realized that we could build what we call self-enforcing models, what we today would call winner-takes-all models. And that meant basically that it was a money machine because markets could not recover when you had this winner-takes-all effect in the marketplace. And that was really an issue that provoked my thinking a lot, because I realized that either you go into that and make a lot of money because we could, or you realize that that is actually a society killer. So what we would today would be called big data AI was already known in the end of the 90s as a very, very dangerous concept. And I decided that it would be my agenda to stop that. Basically, to figure out how to solve that problem. I spent a couple of years analyzing on how to do business models, make them work without enabling the infrastructure to collect personal data. And I was very enthusiastic. I realized, wow, we could do that with models that you today would pretty much see from, for instance, the My Data kind of area, personal data spaces. Then what happened was that on December 1st, 1999, Stefan Brand published his PhD thesis as a Dutch publisher on what today is known as the U-Proof library on blind cryptography. And that really was an eye-opener for me, because what I realized was that all these My Data models are essentially models where someone is trying to act as a trusted party on your behalf, collecting a lot of information, and perhaps they can do good, help you do carry out transactions securely toward third parties, but they will turn in as a centerpiece in control of you. And that really taught me something about that we need to design even better. We need to get the middleman out of the operation. And that quickly brought me into the EU research. So in the early 2000s, I got involved in all the research processes around in EU, and especially on road mapping and identity and privacy. And from there, it just basically took off. Now, what I'm trying to explain to you is also the why we've been so long getting here. Because we basically knew this already at that point. The complexity is just mind-boggling. So when we look at the last couple of years, EU has been pouring out new regulation in a steady stream. Oh, sorry, the Danish headline, sorry about that. PSD2, GDPR, AML, e-privacy, e-money, IDAS. I mean, they're just coming out in a steady stream, huge legal packages. And on the front of these, they appear as if they are conflicting and very, very expensive. If you take, for instance, banking and AML, banks are in the situation where they can get a fine by the AML operations, the banking authorities, because they do not collect enough information to stop crime. Now, the second after, they can get an even bigger fine by the data protection officers because they collect a lot of personal information for no reason. And then day after, Margrethe Vestager will come and give them an even bigger fine because they're doing collusion within banks. I mean, right now, getting these packages to work together to what we can call compliance by design across all these issues is a huge problem. And banking alone is in a situation where banks spend something between 5 and 10% of all their cost only on anti-money laundering, basically, and it's not working. It's a lot of money, and if we can do something about it, it can change a lot. So what happened was that in December last year, we announced a way to start dealing with these things just before COVID-19. And I will get back to how and why and the thinking behind it. But what happened was that when COVID-19 hit, we realized that we actually were sitting with the perfect solutions to start engaging in the pandemics. So we basically put aside the anti-money laundering, and so the big project, and started focusing on rolling out an interim model for the COVID-19. And this is what we're going to talk about now. Now, to keep a bit on the legal side, you perhaps followed me a little bit on the internet and saw some of my comments. And what you will often see is that I think that the biggest problem in Europe is that we consider privacy as something that has anything to do with data protection. Well, hey, wait, data protection, that is what it's all about, isn't it? Well, yes and no. Because if you think about it a little bit different, you can say that privacy ends where the need for data protection begins. Okay, if you need for data protection, it means that someone else has information about you that can be abused against you. And if they need to be protected, that means that they are designed in such a way that you lose control of information. And right now, we are basically in a situation where every time you do anything in a digital space, you lose control of some information because you are identified. Now, I think part of this problem is that the way we're talking about it. So if you go back to GDPR basically says the same thing as the regulation before that did. So why do we need GDPR? Well, fundamentally, what it does do is it changes the imperative, the normative goals, the requirements on system developers and system owners. Where before that, you had data minimization as a principle, but it was not happening. Now, we, for instance, with Article 25, we strengthen that, not to data protection by design or best effort by best settings by default, but basically say that you need to take into account the state of the art, and doing that, you need to do data minimization as good as possible. And that also means that if your application can be solved without collecting personal data, then you're not allowed to collect personal data. So when we talk about privacy by design, it's not about data protection by design. It's about basically saying we don't want personal data at all if avoidable. And I think GDPR gets away with this very, very gently, in the sense that GDPR recognizes that there are conflicts of interest. Anti-crime, research, convenience, all other things is fairly objectives. And your personal individual rights are not necessarily bigger than these. But the default setup is that in case that you can solve these secondary or these other objectives without collecting personal data, you're still collecting data, it's just not personal data, then you have to. That is a very, very big change with GDPR compared to what we had earlier. And as I was involved in part of these pre-regulation processes, this was very deliberate from what I know. Okay, so when we talk about privacy by design in this context, from the legal point, I basically say that we need to basically get rid of as much personal data as possible because we want the data that is secure. Okay, so as an example of trustworthy anonymity, if we take that as an example, consider a paper ballot. In a paper ballot, you have a lot of information about the citizens, where they live, and how old they are. They are allowed to elect to vote, etc. And all that information is stored into a simple authentication and a token, a ballot, a paper ballot that you can use to vote. Then you anonymize, and in that anonymizing, you sign the ballot with the vote you have. It's not a strong signature, but it's enough, because only you can do it. And what comes out of there is something that is trustworthy anonymous. So you have personal data coming in, and you have a process where you basically carry your vote yourself, and what comes out is as anonymous data. Now, an election is special because it actually is so strong that you are not allowed to be able to prove yourself what you actually voted. Typically, that is a much harsher requirement compared to trustworthy anonymity in general. But the point is that this process of you taking information from one context and using it in another context, or so we know that this ballot is only one vote per citizen. That is actually what we're looking for. Okay? So if you take definitions just for a second here, in GDPR, they talk about identified versus identifiable data. Okay? And we talk about, that means that we have three spaces. We have the typical personal data where you're identified. You have where you're not identified at all and you're not identifiable. That's outside GDPR. That's anonymous, not covered by GDPR. And then you have a space here in between the identified and the not identifiable, where you can be not identified, but accountable, conditionally identified. That's a gray zone today. GDPR doesn't really say what works in there. For instance, if a judge can identify you in case you violate some agreement, is that personal data or not? Is that identifiable or not? It's not defined at this point. So it means that right now GDPR doesn't use the term privacy by design at all. It's not in GDPR. Doesn't mention the words privacy by design. They talk about data protection by design. They talk about pseudonymized data. They talk about anonymized data. But you can put a pseudo in front of these and say, well, these are still personal data because the original exists. So it means that it's always possible to go back and redo the same process, and so that every output will be learning of every input. We simply do not have a mechanism to do anonymous data from a personal database. I'm sure that could be discussed, but that would be my claim. Now, IDAS is more complex in the sense that IDAS talk about identification and identification and identification and identification, because everything is identification in IDAS, as if it's in IDAS. What is very, very important to understand is that in IDAS, you also work with the concept of pseudonymous signatures. Okay? IDAS, as we know it, PKI, is always identified. It means it's always collecting personal data. But there's also the ability to make pseudonymous signatures that are both accountable but not identified, or that are fully anonymous. That is within the IDAS regulation, and that is deliberate in Article 5.2. So when we consider this from the point of view of Citizenkey, of how we look at it, then we say that privacy by design is where you are truly anonymous outside GDPR, but doesn't mean you can't make a signature, for instance, as with a ballot, where you can actually sign something. It means that this is related to one and only one person. You can take the same signature and add some kind of conditional identification for accountability, and then you have a full digital signature that can actually replace a PKI signature. Then we talk about, that would be what we call about security by design. I return to that question. And then everything that's personal data, everything that's online, we just say, well, we can't protect personal data. That was something that we realized 10 years ago. I mean, NSA, American military, have a big problem even protecting their databases. So how should we be able to do that? So our agenda is not to say that it has to be either this, and this. We have to protect everything at the same time. But we need to start to having vocabulary, terminology that defines how good is it? Right now, when we talk about privacy by design, it's just about loose intentions, that a little bit better protection, if we have consent, blah, blah, blah. But it's not defined what is good and what is bad. And I think that is the root problem right now in security and in the research community, is that we need to tighten this terminology as it was originally intended. I mean, if we go back to the 1995 report from which John Borking with Dutch scientists did, called Privacy on the Road to Anonymity, if you look it up on the net, it was a great report given the time, given the technologies we had in those days. But somehow this anonymity characterization or definition got lost in the process, and legal professionals tend to equalize privacy and data protection. I don't. I say this is the problem. Okay? So I hope this makes sense. We talk about privacy by design, then we mean you're not accountable. We talk about security by design, that means that we have potentially accountability included. And then we have open space where you have some kind of by policy, by regulation, by rules protection. But that is not really something where we can define the security properties of. So let's go a little bit further. Now, in 2002, I was part of a workshop in the big IST conference in Copenhagen called Living with Security. And there I said we have an existential choice here, okay? We can either have a world where we are always identified, where we're always collecting data, we're always creating more vulnerability, more identity theft, more fraud, more abuse of information. And that will be a constant negative spiral, and it will create distrust, and it will create need for more security in the terms of identification, because that is the problem. When security people think that identification brings security, that they're forgetting that they are creating all sorts of secondary effects. What I said already back in 2002 is that the alternative is to get the positive circle, where you have the virtual ID services or the pseudonymous circles, or what we would call trustworthy identity. It has many names. So that the data, when created, is locked for purpose without having to have all sorts of rules and regulations and bureaucracy trying to protect data, which they're inherently not able to. Now, we know how it went since. I mean, we went the left side here, and the consequences is what we see with the elections and the Brexits and the ad tech and all over the place. And I think we're basically in the same discussion as we were back in 2002. Okay? So what is it actually that we're talking about? In 2012, after 10 years of research and working together with researchers, I gave another talk at the EU Digital Agenda, where I basically said what is about citizen empowerment. It's about ensuring that no matter what kind of crap you have in all the databases already, what is important is if you as a citizen is able to create a new identity every time you go online. Then the recovery starts. As a simple example, if you go online anonymously, use Tor or whatever, and you do it effectively, then Google would not be able to link this session to an existing profile elsewhere. They will have to adapt to your needs in this situation. And whatever information is being collected, as long as you avoid identifying in the process, cannot be used afterwards. Then that means that the challenge is not so much about anonymity versus identification, but ensuring that we get the balances right in the session and then create means so that you can reuse data. This is what we call citizen empowerment. And this is from 2012. Notice, by the way, here that this blue thing here would be your mobile phone, and I'm already at that point talking about we need to pull out the keys out of the mobile phones, out of the computers, so you're not locked into an environment that is controlled by some big tech systems provider. This goes further to the thinking of data for research, because it means that fundamentally we say that the way we think about big data today, you identify it in all sorts of spaces because we need to combine data centrally into profiles. And then after we've done that, we try to pseudo-anonymize these data for some AI thing. That's not the way to do it. We need a different kind of data flow where you do it yourself. Okay? So why the reason why it's been taking so long to get here is that it is very complex. There's a lot of technologies involved here. This is from, I think, 2009. And the one way of thinking of identity in such a way so you get an idea what the problem is. You have here security from the perspective of me. If I'm identified, I don't have control. If I'm not identified, I can have control. But the other part is traceability. So that if I'm not traceable, that means that there can be all sorts of fraud coming in there. I can do crimes. So this is protection against me versus protection for me. And we need both of these. And if we have the balances, then we can start combining them into getting the solutions. And what we're heading is what we call National ID 2.0. So instead of having one identifier where all information is collected about an identifier in the central space, we need to have data split up in multiple identifiers so that you can control how data is reused. Okay, I'm not going to talk about all these different aspects because there's a lot of discussion in each of these technologies. What I would like to say here is that one of our root challenges right now is that we are totally overwhelmed with the complexity. Because most researchers, they focus on a very small space. But we are talking interdisciplinary problems here. And each of these fields are so complex that only the best in that field will actually know. For instance, mixed nets, the difference between a type 2 and a type 3 mixed net is only for specialists to know. The same, how to do revocable biometrics, how to do conditional identification, how to do smart cards hardware. It's very complex stuff. And when we start getting to identity, it really gets obnoxious. I find that this is a good way to look at it when I talk to people. If we have me in the bottom as a citizen, and I'm interacting with some other party in the top, then my security as a citizen, privacy, my security, starts up with me being anonymous, then I'm in control. The problem is that there's not a lot of stuff I can do to get with another party anonymously, because that means that everything I do that can be a risk for the other party, he would of course resist, or she would resist. So that leads normally to a situation where we're always identified. And in a person-to-person interaction like this one, that's pretty okay. The problem is that we start doing digitally, then the problems scale out of control because the internet doesn't forget and it doesn't forgive. So the point here is that if I'm identified, then these accumulation of data goes out of control. But it doesn't have to be like that. We can have a balance between I'm not identified, but I am conditionally identifiable. Okay, so if the counterparty in the transaction can validate that I have made myself conditionally identifiable, accountable, but they can't do it without some other step, for instance, a judge decrypt or something, then we can have the balance between us. So I can share data with you that I can retain control, and as long as I don't do anything wrong, I will retain that control. But the second something goes wrong, I don't pay the bill, something else I do wrong, then the process of holding me accountable can start. But as long as we can stay there, we can start talking about security by design. Now, problem is, of course, that you and me can have all sorts of interest in cheating others. We don't pay tax, we plan a crime, blah, 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 all sorts of stuff. So it means that other citizens' rights also have to be taken into account. And this is what we would call compliance, as expressed by legislation. So when we talk about security by design, we mean this space where my security, your security, other citizens' security has been resolved without me being identified. because that means that we have non-interdependence. We don't have to protect these data. So the services can be free, they can be shared, they can be put in blockchain, they can be put to China or US or whatever, because we only share the contextual data for that purpose. And that data does not involve a threat to me as a citizen, and thereby, by accumulation, a threat to society, as we know from ad tech. So this is basically where we are targeting, where we want to be. And if we have this, then we can start talking about GDPR compliance by design, data minimization by design, or privacy by design. Typically, most transactions in society involving payments or communication cannot be handled anonymously, because that means that I can do stuff getting away with it. But some transaction can be done anonymously. As an example, well, I don't know if it's a good case to take, but let's do it. When the Germans invaded Holland in 1940, they went to Amsterdam. And what they could do in Amsterdam is that they could take the database over Jews in Amsterdam. Okay, and as a consequence, very few Dutch Jews actually survived. In Denmark, that database was under the Jewish control. That was not in the public sector. The Germans could not get that database. Okay, so it means here we have a situation here where two very similar countries were invaded. One country did not have the protection in place to protect their citizens. The other country had. And therefore, the Jews survived in Denmark and not in Holland. I don't think it was because we were that different in our attitude towards the Germans, or because Germans are still Nazis. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not pulling that card. I'm saying the security by design in preparation of that situation meant that knowledge about your religion, your ethnicity, etc., that is so sensitive, so we actually don't want that in a database linked to your identity. You see that? So that is, we have a lot of other examples. We have the elections, but what is really cool here is that testing for COVID-19 is a good example of something that we really want to have anonymously. I'll continue into that. First, Citizenkey, what is that? It is first a card. I have one here, which is a smart card, really nice smart card, very efficient. It's got a display on the card. It's got a fingerprint reader, and it's talking BLE as a Bluetooth. So what it meant basically is that this card will be able to communicate without leaking a persistent identifier. Okay, that should be the root part of your identity. That's what we're designing for. And what we're going to launch is something which we call five-factor security. Okay, we know the basic three factors: biometrics, something you are; hardware, something you have; or something you know, a password, so that you can delay in case of breaking into hardware and stealing your biometrics. But that's not enough. Typically, these factors are really bad, poorly implemented. I'll give you an example. Last year, 2019 alone, we had 21 cases in Canada alone where someone tried to enter Canada with a Danish passport, of which the biometrics on the passport, the verified legitimate passport, did not match the national ID, the citizen with the national ID, with the name on the passport. Try hearing that again. It meant that in Canada alone, last year, 2019 alone, there were 21 cases where they caught someone trying to enter Canada with a Danish passport with data fraud involved on a legitimate issued passport. And Danish passports is considered some of the best in the world. That says a lot about the state of situation in identity and security right now, globally. It's really, really bad. Now, part of that is because we have this thinking of three-factor security as the best we can do. Because we are creating structures that are basically unsecure, because they are vulnerable to all sorts of attacks. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a fourth factor, which we call purpose-specific keys. That basically means that we have a policy never to reuse keys or identifiers, literally. That will redefine all three factors up there, because it means you can't share a biometric, because that would be sharing a non-revocable biometric. You cannot just identify the hardware, because that would be sharing a reusing an identifier. You cannot just use a hash of a password, because a hash of a password is still the password. A hash of personal data is still personal data. So this actually redefines all three factors and requires a very special subset of implementations that are much stronger than we are used to thinking. So that basically means that, to be specific, the biometrics will involve something that you have control over. Nobody should be able to authenticate as you just by spoofing your biometrics. You see the point? And the same thing with hardware, same thing with passwords. These things need to be taken out of bounds and mixed with something that are cryptographically much stronger, in such a way that you create new keys for new purposes. This also, by the way, means that you can forget about blockchain. I mean, Citizenkey is post-blockchain, because we cannot use accounts we used for multiple purposes. And we don't like any kind of revocation schemes, because that turns into data retention. So if you have long-lived keys, like in PKI or for the specialist in the room, blinding at use, like Identity Mixer, we can't go there, because that would involve something that require an overhead with a data retention scheme. So in Citizenkey, we go only blinding at issuance in order to contain the ability to fraud keys and do identity theft, etc. I could talk a lot about this, but I won't say much more about it. Just say that if an attacker cannot reuse a key acquired from one context in another context, you get much, much stronger security compared to what you have today. Cybersecurity is very often about stealing keys or knowledge from some space and using it in another space. If you can't do that because it's not designed to be able to do that, we don't accept that kind of keys. Then you reverse the balance between the attacker and the defender. Now, there's a fifth factor that's even more powerful, and that is what we learned from fault-tolerant systems. If an attacker gets in, and they will get in, there's no such thing as perfect security. What is important to ensure is that they don't get access to data that can be abused. Okay, you can talk about recipes and that kind of content, but if you ensure that you don't put personal data into a space, if you don't identify in the space, then that is much more secure compared to situation where you have an identification, you have some kind of perimeter security, which is just failing. So what Citizenkey is about is to make these containers where the applications can run and operate. We don't make applications. That's not the point. But in such a way that they are contained by design, and enable the possibility of having non-identification. Okay, so you will see this image very often when you see Citizenkey. It's just trying to illustrate the point that you are turned into a lot of identities, and through the card, these are linked to that degree that you can't even hand over the private key to someone else. Take an example. If I put in $1 million on an account and then hand over the credentials for that account to someone else, I have created a transaction without a registration. And if we start building security on identification in each location, each contact point, we also enable identity theft. But if you cannot identify with a biometric and something else, if I cannot hand it over to you, that means that we can also not do identity lending, identity rendering, and all these kinds of identity fraud that is basically ravishing the world today. At the same time, as we protect citizens from the abuse of information in other contexts. Now, so what Citizenkey was about is basically a peer-to-peer network. There's no central entity that act as man in the middle. And it's based on a zero-knowledge protocol based on U-proof, if people know what that means. And each identity is loosely built by loosely coupled building blocks in such a way that it's customized to context. So I can have one identity that's basically just an existing login to a bank. As is, no change whatsoever. Another identity that's just a login to a healthcare system somewhere. A third login that's just a login to whatever. And then I can in parallel start having new identities that are not identified. And I can transfer data from one identity into another. Data portability on the lowest level with blinding cryptography. For those that I can't get feedback from the community to see how well this is understood, it's a little bit annoying. But the point is that I need to be able to build a trustworthy identity, and that identity is worthless unless I can take information from historic information and push it into that space so that I customize this identity to the exact purpose of why I'm creating this identity. And the next identity, I'll do the same, but that's other kind of proofs because it's another kind of transaction, it's another application. But what we get to the point is that where you can sign, legally sign within IDAS without identifying. You can communicate. If everybody is in agreement, then you can do it anonymously. Otherwise, it will be anonymous but accountable under the rules of the national structure. You can share and reuse data across identities. You will be able to prove credentials with blind technologies can do. You will be able to pay. A payment is a very special problem when actually start looking into it because it's a very special multi-stakeholder security problem. I won't try to explain to you here. But the point is you can do all this without identifying in the transaction. So you can start rolling out Citizenkey on top of whatever you got today, and then gradually start upgrading towards more secure structures, starting where you actually need it the most. You have got asynchronous upgrade ability. Okay, so what does this mean for COVID-19? Now, first of all, what we realized is that COVID-19 doesn't need all this functionality up front. It's actually a much more simple problem. So we decided to launch what we would call Citizenkey Classic, which is based on classic cryptography. And what that basically means is that the card can create a new identity which I can use to get a test. And where I'll take it to the next here. So it works like this. It could be any issuer for that, doesn't matter. I can get the card while standing in queue to be tested. Then I can have an authorized tester that can check whether the person delivering the test sample is the same as the one that logged into the card. The test is then locked to the card, not to my identity, but to a new identity. And then the test can then flow to the lab, whatever. There will be a delay there. But the containment, the linkage to the test specific identity will remain. And then eventually the lab will provide a result which is then can send to the identity encrypted, so that I can get the test result down to the card and it can show in the display on the card what is the test result. Okay, this means that I can, in the next situation, I can prove at the checkpoint, at an access control, entering a workplace, I can prove with the biometrics that I have been tested with a certain test result without identifying. Whether the test person knows who I am, that's another discussion. So we need to keep that separate. But I can do the anonymous testing, okay, and I can create new anonymous proofs for new checkpoints. So it means basically that I can get a test from any location, and the result I can use at any other checkpoint. And there's no national ID linkage. There's no digital signature linkage. That means that this works cross-border. This can be rolled out, and we do not depend on any existing infrastructure for that sake. We can use the internet for doing that. We can discuss this a lot. I won't try to do that. We'll get back to that. So what we're basically saying is that when we talk about COVID-19 and trustworthy anonymity as a business enabler, is that we've been spending a lot of time focused on the treatment and finding the sick. But what's much more important is that we need to figure out how to prove a negative, because that's valuable if you want people to fly, if you want people in a social space, if you want people traveling, etc. They need to be able to prove that they are not sick. And our healthcare systems are designed to prove, to handle the sick entities. That is a fundamental problem. So it basically means that we have until now, we've been trying a lot of time trying to get security to healthcare. We need to try to do research without creating central profiles. Telemedicine, trustworthy AI, personal medicine, wearables, all this. There's a lot of effort going on in that field, and they are not doing very well, to say the least. But with pandemics, we have an entirely new kind of problem. We need to bring health data to security. There's a lot of checkpoints where you would consider using health data. But suddenly it's a critical issue if you want to get into the country, whether we actually import disease. And it depends a little bit of the policies, etc., how bad that gets. But we already see requirements that you run around with one of these tracking devices or proofs just in order to get into a restaurant or whatever. And we need mechanisms to do that decently. Now, if we do this identified, it means that all the testing points will be collecting DNA, collecting proteins, very, very sensitive data. We will be using weak identity system, which create all sorts of fraud potential, so I can use someone else's test to get through. We already see that. But it also means that all checkpoints leak personal data. And it creates resistance, it creates breaches, and what it also creates is a lot of GDPR restrictions because these data are deeply sensitive. And the next problem is that because we're doing this testing linked to identity models, it also means that they are non-interruptible. So right now, if I in Denmark go and get testing, and I don't have a Danish ID, I can't get the test result. I can give them my phone number, and they will call me if I am infected. But I cannot get a proof that I'm negative in order to stay at a hotel and prove that I'm not a disease risk. But if we could do trustworthy anonymous, it means basically that we can have most of the sensitivity problems resolved up front because we don't have the metadata that identify. It means that we can have more testing and more test providers because we don't have the same expensive setup because the citizens themselves is carrying their security. It also means that we'll have strong identity, but only for the test. I only prove that I am the same that got tested. I don't prove anything else about me. It also means it can't be used for anything else. But it also means that we don't throw around personal data all over the place. We can start doing trustworthy data sharing. We can start and avoid all these restrictions and fears that we have today. So we can have compliance without restriction, which is really what we need to enable. But the real key is to have an open model so that any test provider can provide solutions for any checkpoint, where citizens themselves are carrying their proofs. That's really important to do that. Okay, but we go further, because what we planned to do was to make a pandemic mitigation tool. And the first thing we can consider is that instead of discussing whether we should have a decentralized proximity tracing on a smartphone, where Google and Apple control the keys, we need to take them further and put them on the card itself, so they never leave the card. So we can do card-to-card proximity tracing. This can be made in such a way that it is interoperable with the smart card-based one. So I don't want to discuss those, but what we want to take this is a lot of steps further than just proximity tracing. Because first, if I can prove to you in the wireless space before you get into infection proximity that I am not infected, or you can prove that you are sensitive, then we can resolve that before we get into that distance. And we can do it without having to run around with a smartphone, which doesn't work in hospitals, doesn't work in care centers, a lot of places where they don't work. So we can get them down into devices that are much more energy efficient from that perspective. But try to consider this. So if citizen A meets citizen B meets citizen C, okay, this can be an infection chain. Citizen A can go and get a test. Okay, so they have an identity with an anonymous test result. Okay, and citizen B does the same. At the point where they meet, they thought they were not infected. Now, if either of these realize that they were infected, if it's B, then he will start speculating who infected me. Not only report to C, but also go back and see who infected me. And A will do the same, the reverse. So right now, if we look at the proximity tracing apps, they have all these stuff about how long time have you been within distance, blah, blah, blah. What I really think we should do is basically make an anonymous contact point and let the citizens themselves resolve whether this was an infection point. We can, on top of that, have manual tracing. That's fine. But if we could distribute this in the anonymous space by creating anonymous connections, that means that citizen A and citizen B can resolve here, okay, you probably didn't infect me. We will have different kinds of scenarios, okay? In my social network, I have 3 children around the age of 20. During the last 6 months, there have been 6 or 8 situations where the alarm went in their community that someone might be infected. They were getting tested. These young people, they knew exactly who had been in which distance and what their risk was of being quarantined. Long before any app was reporting it, long before any health authority responded, they were already very, very alert to this. But they have no means to do that respectfully towards each other. They have no way to do this anonymous. So it's happening over social media, most of that. But if I can create a linkage to everyone I've been in contact with for the last 14 days and can resolve this was not relevant, this is not relevant, this is not relevant, I can very quickly get back to a very few points where these are relevant to consider further. And if I can take strain data from my test and you can take strain data from your test and push them into the anonymous contact space and we can compare it, then we can actually verify that this was an infection point, that you infected me. The next point is that if I know who I infected and who infected me, I can connect these into infection chains. So we can actually create anonymous data elements, data spaces, which researchers can access without knowing who the citizens are that they are basically analyzing. And the citizens can do that themselves. My point here is that we get to the point that when you analyze all the aspects of COVID-19, my claim would be that until the point of hospitalization, where I need treatment, I'm not able to manage my own health and my own communication, my own identities. I can't see any need that actually require identification or accountability with state-of-the-art tools. There's a lot of things I could take here. one issue that will immediately pop up is the issue of research. And so let's step a step back to that, because I think that's important. I talked about the positive circle and the negative circle. The negative circle is what we call big data AI. Big data AI today is already, before we start training the AI, we already created the problem. Okay, because that requires a lot of identification, a lot of data right now, where the argument is that in order to do AI, we need to identify you. We need to collect a lot of personal information. And then we need to create very intimate profiles. We are creating new personal data by combining data from multiple sources out of your control. And we discuss whether there's consent, or whether it's legitimate interest, or what kind of de-anonymization that we have. But we cannot de-identify until after we combine the data. So the intimate profiling is necessary in order to do AI training. And the next problem is then that this turns into what we can call treacherous AI, where we don't know what the logic is inside the AI, because it's just correlations. That's one thing. But the other point is that it does that, typically server-side, or out of your control, and it requires new personal data in order to match it against the model. What this is a negative spiral that just mass-produce personal data all over the space with all sorts of negative externalities, for the point of what? Yeah, well, the AI probably can do some good. They can do diagnostics, can do whatever. That's not the debate. The problem is all the negative that is inherent in this approach. What we could do instead was, if we could collect trustworthy data that's not identified, and combine that trustworthy in such a way that we don't create these intimate profiles, but specific for the training of the AI model. And then ensure when I actually use the AI model, I either do it online contained with a new identity, or do it client side, also without creating personal data. Then what we have is small data. Okay, so the difference between big data and small data is that big data will collect and produce new personal data all the time. Small data will not collect and not produce new personal data. But essentially, the AI model can be exactly the same one. Okay? There's a lot of discussion about this one, I know that. So how can it work? Well, for instance, it can work interactively. I can have access to all my data. I can have data portability, and then I can be requested to provide the linkage between two information sets, and I can provide that into a new identity. But I can do that anonymously if I have the tools. The problem is today I don't have the tools. We have democracy that's basically saying that you have to be identified all the time. And we know that this immediately is used by ad tech and also all stuff, all other entities, because we as a democracy haven't created tools to secure our citizens. It's our own fault. But we could do it in such a way that we can also do research. I'm not saying this is easy, and I don't want to having to respond to each and every research project. That's not what I'm saying. But if a research project have the ethical committee saying that this research project is okay and this is not okay, with data, personal data that's out of my control, based on profile that's out of my control, versus an ethical committee that says that if this algorithm goes to the citizens in the population, and then it would be an anonymous result. And if the ethical committee tells me that this is probably anonymous, and I can decide to trust that, then I can instruct my devices to just respond automatically. I don't need to deal with the issues where that is anonymous. Whether we want to do research that goes beyond that into a more sensitive space, okay, let's discuss that as a separate issue, but most research can actually happen fully anonymously. We just need to organize it. So my point is, what did we miss in the first wave? You cannot do anonymous testing, and the point which I split this slide. I'll just go back to that. October 12th, there came a report from Council of Europe on digital solutions to fight COVID-19. It's actually not a bad report, but the point is that the issues that it's only focusing on a small subset of problems. But most of the problems I've been talking about here are not even addressed. And a good example of that is, in the report it says, regardless of the type of test used, viral or antibody, mandatory testing is highly invasive measure as involves the use of biometric samples to detect the health status of individuals. If you read that text, it points to the problem of our age. We assume we cannot make things privacy by design. And because we assume it, we don't even ask the questions where we could do it. And state of the art have been able to do that for several years, actually. So a lot of the stuff that's being done wrong in the healthcare systems today are now being pushed into the open space of civil society for no other reason that we just forgot to think. And GDPR was created in order to say, now we have to think, we have to do privacy impact assessment, but we're not doing it. We're creating something that we call privacy impact assessment, but we ignore most of the big problems. And I'm not criticizing the ones doing it because of the complexity. What I am saying, we have a real problem because it's not in the interest of Europe to just copy US or China, because that will be a society killer. What we need to do is to reverse this and start doing a European version. And this is a good example where we start with anonymous testing. Okay, we are not, 99% of the tests are not positive. We are testing to know if you are healthy. And if you're healthy, you need that information back in an operational version so you can use it to access the social activities, the workplaces, the traveling, et cetera, and you don't have that in an organized version today. We also need to activate the wireless space. Our protocols today, almost all wireless protocols are basically surveillance-oriented. Whoever got the idea that 5G standard should have mandatory device identification in the standard? It says that you have data retention in the standard. Come on, this is a governance failure of a huge magnitude. But almost all technical standards today are like that. And the wireless protocols are really bad. Even though we could solve it, and we could implement it in, and we're going to do it in a card like this, doing zero knowledge protocols, because we can't do it in a mobile phone, because the big tech industry prevents it, because they want to have key control, and the governance system doesn't deal with that. We can, on a card like this, we can create anonymous contact points, basically just a variant on Diffie-Hellman. We can take the proximity algorithm out of control from the Google and Facebook and Apple's and into here, so that Google and Apple will never get access to the keys. And you don't have to put your smartphone into a Bluetooth communication state. And anonymous testing also involves the identities, the anonymous identities to communicate. That's also part of that. You say proximity testing. I mean, I think it's fine that we had the discussion of central and decentralized. I think that is a sign that we are taking that serious. But the way we did it was not mature, because we only focused on very few things and actually ended up giving big tech control. And now they will be using that to force identity control of your digital signatures in a smartphone. That means that you will always be under surveillance. We shouldn't. We should be pulling the keys out of the smartphones into the hands of the citizens. Also, I think we spent a lot of over-focus on distant measurements, which I didn't really understand why we do it. That's been creating problems all over the place. But that's another discussion. I won't criticize that, because it's one of the better things. But what I am saying is that we have forgotten the discussion of distributed infection tracing. What about enabling the citizens themselves to help the infection trace? We are not giving them tools at all. So instead, we're hiring a lot of people that has to call around, and they do pretty good, but they don't know who've been meeting, they don't know who we know, and a lot of that could happen in advance, anonymously, upfront. But we're not creating tools for citizens to do that. if we have full chain analysis, the proximity tracing thing is not good for full chain analysis. Who was the original one infecting you? So right now, today, we have to do it in the full big data approach where we centralize everything. Come on, we don't have to do that. And this, I was talking about small data research. We need to shift away from the big data approach to a trustworthy data approach where the citizens themselves combine and share anonymous data for research. And then it's no problem. Then it's okay. So, well, I could talk a little bit about what Citizenkey also is, but I don't think that's relevant. We can take that afterwards in case. I could talk a little bit about the very interesting thing is that EU's digital strategy from February 2020, just before COVID-19, start talking about the need to have trustworthy identities. And then the second that we move into operational is start talking about identification, just having a central space of personal data. I mean, come on, there was a mismatch here. I could talk about the definition of trustworthy and where it originates from. I don't want to do that. I think we're going to step it. So with that, I think I would start opening up for discussion and for questions. What's the time? I haven't lost the track of time here. Oh, yeah. Isabel? Does this make sense? Let's start there. I'll take it down to this one, I think.
Dave here. Thank you very much for the presentation. I really liked it, and I especially liked the fact, the point that you're making, that basically any information collecting system nowadays is actually a surveillance system, and that we should reverse that. And indeed, I do see that the whole discussion about COVID-19 16 made things a lot more complex due to that fact. I do have one question. I mean, in the beginning of the presentation, you talked a bit about that you could use this system even to sign documents or authorize transactions. Mm-hmm. But doesn't that also introduce then a challenge with respect to auditability?
About what?
Auditability. There's the possibility to audit what happened.
Yeah.
Not specifically talking about fraudulent transactions, but for example, if you want to research illegal transactions or non-ethical transactions.
Yeah, of course. I mean that's why I'm talking about anti-money laundering, because anti-money laundering is actually one of the very, very complex cases of that. I think I can show you a slide. Just a second. Not this one. This is actually the discussion of anti-money laundering and the kind of complexity we're talking about here. Because if you have a citizen key in full implementation, then each new identity would be a new transaction, and the other part can also do the same thing. And that means that the transaction is happening in a non-identified space. But because it's non-identified, also means that the banks and the police and the tax authorities can make much stronger requirements into that space. They could, for instance, link the payment to an actual trade without doing surveillance of the citizens. You can see my point? What we need to do is to activate these kinds of spaces for trading in such a way that instead of trying to do anti-crime through surveillance, we rather want to have it upfront validated so that the criminals can't get in there in the first place. And then we can have conditional mechanisms if we realize, well, this was not perfectly secure anyway. I don't believe in perfect security. But that means that when you sign a trade, there's a contract. But that contract is much more sensible if you know who's engaging in that contract. Most B2C, et cetera, are just standard things that could be fully open, shared for VAT, et cetera. But the second that infrastructure knows who are trading with whom, it turns into a big tech attack on both the companies and the citizens. Consider, for instance, Amazon. what they're doing front running of information. You can say that's for auditing, blah, 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 but what it really is, it's putting them in a position of winner takes all control about trading positions. I don't know if it answers your question.
Yeah, to a certain extent. However, I do see some ethical challenges pop up if you try to not have a block list on what is not allowed, but instead want to go to an allow list of these transactions are allowed.
Yeah, I understand.
But that's maybe another discussion.
I understand your point, and the problem there is really relevant, because we're not saying Citizenkey is designed as a model of models, basically, so you can implement anything here. We don't define the rules, we don't define the requirements. That is result in a peer-to-peer setup. It also means that someone can make a regulation that says that you are not allowed to criticize Boris Johnson or Donald Trump or whoever. And if you do that, you're put to jail. I mean, we have countries in the world that does that. Consider Hong Kong.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it means that this is where we have human rights. This is where we have regulation that set limits on what you can actually require. Okay, it's not up to us to define. That is a parliament decision.
Yeah, or indeed you could use the ethical committee that you pointed out, use to monitor that space, of course.
Yeah, you can. My one realization that we have is that any kind of problem can actually be resolved in any number of ways, and we need a market to compete about what is the best way. So this never stops. If you today made a transaction or an identity for one purpose in a certain way, tomorrow you can create a new building block in an entirely different way for the same application, but it works differently, and that is fine, because you got different providers, you got different application developers, you got different banks, you got different etc. Different payment schemes involved. If you get my point.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is it's not to have a one-size-fits-all, but to have the ability to change recurrently, to evolve at the same time as you maintain your history, control of your history.
Yeah, but I totally agree with the basic principle that we should go from systems that are by definition a sort of surveillance systems to a different model that better protects your identity. I think that's a strong message.
Yeah, and there is a really crucial point here, is that the regulation is already in place.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
badly implemented.
Yeah, it's governance problem and it's an implementation problem. It's a design problem, but the regulation, there has been really, really deep work on the regulation to ensure that this is in place. We don't need changes in GDPR. We don't need changes in IDAS. We don't need changes in any of the other regulations in order to do this.
Yeah, true. So I'm scanning through the chat, looking for some questions. I see one from Archibald. How many citizen cards are currently in use? So how broadly adapted is this system at this point in time?
Oh, I didn't say that. It's not deployed.
Not deployed at all.
No. It is under implementation.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're trying to do is to get work with the banks to have them deploy it, because we wanted to have the savings on anti-money laundering to pay for the non-profit rollout. And then came COVID-19, and we just realized that this was a much cheaper and much faster rollout, because we have no dependency on national ID systems. And the value of reopening faster and more intelligent are just enormous. So what we're doing right now is that we are trying to create a faster track to roll out cards with only the basic functionality focused on getting the anonymous testing and anonymous proofs. And basically this setup to start with, in such a way that citizens can start having smart cards that they can use for then reuse for other purposes, because the card can create new identities for any purpose. If it's clear.
Yeah, check.
And what is exactly the role of the banks?
Excuse me?
What is exactly? Oh, sorry. Yes, Max. what will be exactly the role of the banks?
I don't decide.
Providing the cards, but
Oh no. It's just who's going to pay for the first rollout, who's going to push it out there, and there's multiple ways there. We're working with asynchronous upgrades, so it could be you as a citizen buy a card and just start using it. It could be that your employer starts issuing cards to all employees that has to get to work, and then the employees can use it for all other purposes. So it's about to create a sharing economy effect. You just need to have the card from someplace, and then you can use it for all the other purposes.
Okay.
And what I forgot to say is that Citizenkey Health Passport is going to be a non-profit and a sharing economy model where the benefactors, the corporates that get faster reopening, share the cost of operating it. It's not going to be government subsidized. We don't want to do that, because then bureaucrats start dictating what we can do and cannot do. That's for parliaments, that's not for bureaucrats, in our view.
So what is really the position of the government at this moment regarding this innovation? At least in Denmark. Don't know if you know from other countries.
I'd rather not comment on that from the perspective that it's not rolled out, it's not decided, and we are in negotiations. I would say so much that I think we failed on the first wave. I think that we spent a lot of time on decentralized proximity apps, but failed on almost all other digital aspects connected with COVID-19. And I think we need to learn on this very fast, because pandemics are not over. If that answers your question.
Yeah. I just read here another question from Archibald. How do you implement a card that has a display and input? What are the dimensions of a card? Isn't just such a card much thicker than current smart cards?
No, I got it here. It looks like a credit card. It's a system chip with Bluetooth BLE with a display, a e-ink display, and a fingerprint and a user interaction. But what we're actually going to do, this card was not, the hardware was not designed for Citizenkey originally. And what we're going to do is pull a lot of the functionality out of the card to make a split key mechanism, so that if you lose the card, well, you can just get a new one. But it's basic. Almost right now, it's pretty much state of the art in the field, but more providers are emerging. I mean, you have Java cards coming out, Multos cards. This is another provider which originally targeted the blockchain. Oh, by the way, Citizenkey is not blockchain, because blockchain is reuse of keys, so we are not going to work with that.
Yeah, I think that was clear already during the presentation.
Well, not as clear as I would like to be. I hate blockchain.
That's clear, Stephan. I see another question. How are these cards issued? Can there be multiple issuers, or is there one central?
No. The individual cards will be fully identical. I mean, basically, you can go to the queue to a testing provider, and you can get a card from a batch of cards just in the hand, and you can enroll while waiting for the test, and you can start with that. And then you can upgrade identity as you go. Of course, you can't do very much with with a card in that situation, but it is the strength of the cryptographic mechanism is that it will learn as you go, and the learning is not an AI learning. It's because you build the key structure through your interactions, if that makes sense. So it means that the same card can support a Danish citizen in Denmark, and the Danish citizen can also have something in Italy or what else, where they can support the Italian structure for whatever that is. And Citizenkey in Italy will adapt to Italy, and the same card will be able to adapt to the Danish structure in Denmark.
Yeah, it sounds interesting. Would be nice to see the technical design of that ID.
Oh yeah, there's gone a lot of effort into that, I'll tell you.
Dave, do you want to maybe read the next question?
Yeah, it's also from Archibald, I think. Let's see, because I don't understand it. Yeah, so what about if you don't use the card? I can give the card away, right? So how is this system going to prohibit me from getting a card and then passing it on after doing something I shouldn't have done?
After doing something you shouldn't have done?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, in the process I describe here, there's no accountability because there's no need for accountability. That's the claim. If they are, then discuss that. When you roll out, the issue of conditional identification kicks in. So if you do something you shouldn't have done, you're not going to get away with it, because when you're enrolled, you're enrolled. You don't get to enroll twice. If you get my point.
Now I understand that, but what's prohibiting me from just giving the card to someone else?
Oh, the biometrics, two things basically. Biometrics on the card means that it's locked to your biometrics, so they have to spoof your biometrics. Mm-hmm. The other point is that this will be your identity, so you can't just give them a card with some of your identity. You give them all your identity if you do that. You see the point? So it's so from the point of view of the citizen, you get total control, but the control is also so powerful that if you give away that control, if you do engage in voluntary identity renting and lending, it affects you. So if we put a passport on the card, for instance, if we go back to the Canadian problem, you would not be able to spoof my biometrics and play me in Canada, because there can't be two identities. There can't be two set of biometrics to the same root identity. It doesn't work like that. But it's a very, very complex question on revocable biometrics and how to do that properly. So I think it's beyond this context to discuss that.
Okay, so maybe make the question a bit more generic. What about non-repudiation? What about if identities are not linked to actions? How can someone else prove that I did something?
Oh, but they are. You create a new identity for each action. And if that action requires accountability, that means that you have to provide a proof that you cannot retract. So if I said something like that, that would be a misunderstanding. Because otherwise, if I could just ignore the contract, then I could loan a lot of money and just disappear. I mean, it's not going to work like that.
Okay.
But the issue of, as I said when discussing GDPR, the discussion of identifiability versus identification is a gray zone. Mm-hmm. Okay, so in Citizenkey, there's no backdoor key. What we're talking about, making transaction-specific front doors that are specifically encrypted for that specific transaction. Basically meaning that if you want to build a profile on a citizen, you have to open all proofs with everyone involved that has the operation as a trusted operator in order to figure out what is my profile. And someone would stop that immediately, because that would be total failure of any protection in the system.
We're having some more questions or clarifications on the previous question.
Yeah.
Archibald, you write an example. I get tested with corona, but I sell this card to someone else who doesn't want to go to school tomorrow, for instance.
Well, that's
impossible.
But I mean that's why you got biometrics on the card. That's why biometrics is one of the things that you need to use, because otherwise people would be frauding, and they are doing that today. If you create social structures that say that if you go to Germany without having a test, then you have to go into 14 days quarantine. People will pay a lot of money to avoid 14 days in quarantine on some strange German airport hotel. And if they can do that, then they will do that. Okay, so I understand the problem, but the way you prevent it is by ensuring that they are linked to identity much tighter than the structures that you use today. This is about a general upgrade of all identity, but it's voluntary. Okay, we're not trying to say that it can be done with asynchronous upgrade.
And then any new card you will be using, you will be enrolling again?
No.
How does it work exactly? I mean, you use a card for some specific.
There is a mechanism. There is a synchronization mechanism. Basically, what happens when we roll out in the full scale, when we move into the national ID support, is that you're going to have two cards that will be continuously synchronized. Basically, one you're using in mobile and one you're using at home. And then you're going to have two additional backups. One is a cold backup, and one is what happens when you die, or in terms of emergency care and hospitals. So really, when you do identity the way we do it, we have to ensure that all these things are taken care of, and they will be scrutinized. But there's a lot of details to discuss. So I can't answer that in short. If it's clear, we are not naive at all on that. We know exactly how dangerous this is potentially.
Yeah, we get here some the reactions. Pity that you don't explain more about the backup question. Sounds really interesting indeed. And also how that works, but one in your mobile you mentioned, and the other card. It's beginning to be a bit more complicated.
It is very complicated. That's why I showed the slide on all the technologies involved and all the requirements involved. Essentially, we don't want to trust the card. Okay, we have to be in a situation where I can just do like that with a card and continue, and nobody can abuse that card against me because there's nothing on the card that can be used, because there's not a single key that can be reused. Okay, so it means that a backup is not a backup in the traditional sense. It's about synchronization. So the question is, how do you take a new card and enroll it into the structure in such a way that you don't get other kinds of biometrics on that card versus the biometrics that I'm already using? And to do that, you go into biometric encryption of different kinds. We have a number of different mechanisms planned, and we have a really cool one, but we're not 100% certain of it yet. It's not security by obscurity. We know we will get scrutinized before we roll out. So we don't believe in that. I hope it answers the question.
Well, I would like to know more details, but I guess it's enough for today.
These are very, very fundamental and very, very huge questions. But
yeah, I can understand.
But if you lose a card, you can just erase it and use it again in another identity. But you have to. It's a tamper resistant, so the biometrics has to go. And that would be.
What are really the flaws of your system?
Excuse me?
What are the flaws of your system? Do you have? Are you happy with all of it, or do you recognize some vulnerabilities?
I have to answer both ways. First of all, I don't think any system is perfect. Point number one. Point number two. As I showed with the five-factor security, this is designed to have an entirely different kind of security weakness parameter, because everything is revocable and nothing will, no attack will scale. Okay, that means essentially that the security discussion changes. Right now, the attacker are always the powerful one because you're weak. And you're weak because you can be targeted, you can be tracked, you can be identified. And every time you do anything, you basically trigger an attack. Whether that attack is collecting information about you for profiling, then you just fed back as ads, is just a kind of attack. So what you need to do is by changing identity constantly, you ensure that you always evaluate the credentials according to the specific situation. And since there's no revocation of keys, it means that you as an application are responsible for choosing when you need to have renewal of credentials of some kind. You understand what I mean? And COVID-19 is a good example. Because I proved negative with COVID-19 yesterday, doesn't mean that I'm COVID-19 negative tomorrow. So it's a checkpoints policy that decides how new should the test be in order for the checkpoint policy to approve. As an obvious example.
Yeah, it remains a difficult concept. So looking at the time, I think I want to close with one final question. How open or closed is your technology? Is it patented? Is it closed source? Is it open source? What are your plans about that?
uProof is open source. The library is open source. We learned from the way open source work for instance, with blockchain, that it was instantly forked into two different. So we're not going to go open source with Citizenkey. I know we're going to be harassed for it. And I know we have to have scrutiny. That's not the question. But we think that the basic problem and the value of going there is that this is something that we need to orchestrate. It's not something that we provide as a software tool for others to do. We are building basically infrastructure layer stuff. And I know the open source group will harass us for this, and they should. But it won't be open source because we don't want to have multiple citizen keys. We are competing against entirely different structures, and we should do that.
Yeah.
I don't know if it explains it clear.
Well, this will probably be a discussion of 1.5 hours in itself.
Yeah, I know that. I know that.
I know that.
Yes.
I
know that.
So, personally, I would like to thank you for this presentation. I really enjoyed it. I think it's an extremely interesting concept, but there's so many layers of complexity that it's going to take me a while to wrap my head around it.
Yeah.
But yeah, for my part, thank you for being here and hosting this or presenting at this meetup. Thank you very much.
Just one point that I would like to emphasize here, so it doesn't get misunderstood. There is no citizen key server collecting information. Okay, there's no citizen key man in the middle. You can do peer-to-peer interactions, and you choose which kind of anonymization system you choose. Okay, this is not about some central hub thing. There's not some blockchain thingy with everything has to be online in a structure that is you can analyze. You can do peer-to-peer as you want to.
Okay. Cool.
Now we still keep receiving some questions, but given the time, we will stop it here.
Yeah. Okay.
Stephan, thanks a lot for your presentation, for your insights.
Well,
very inspiring.
I hope I provided what you asked for to start with. I don't know if it's clear how groundbreaking this can be if it blows out.
Yeah, I hope that for the participants has been clear enough. But it's true that it's a very interesting topic. You can be hours talking about it.
Oh yeah,
long. So, really interesting.
But there's so many dimensions. So, for instance, the children, the life cycle of a child before they take control of their identity. I mean, that alone we can spend a day on that without any problem.
And it even depends on the country.
Oh yeah, that too.
Really makes a difference. Well, thanks, Stephan, for sharing your insights with us.
Okay,
really
you're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for attending.
Yeah, and see you next time.
See you next time. Good evening.